Assalamu alaikum, my dear friends. May God grant you health. Greetings to all viewers. It's been a while since we've seen each other. A lot has happened during this time, and many events have piled up that require our attention. New channels and interviews have appeared in the information space. There have been a number of statements and assessments which also help us better understand the processes taking place today within Circassian society as well as around it. We will definitely return to all these topics in future episodes, but today, of course, we need to talk about the most significant date for Circassians around the world, the Day of Remembrance for our ancestors who fell for our freedom. Despite the change of generations, shifts in the political climate, and constant attempts to redefine the agenda, it is May 21st that continues to be the central point of historical memory for the Circassians. Every year, around this date, the information space comes alive with statements, debates about the boundaries of what's acceptable, and attempts to influence public sentiment and the very perception of memory. And it is on days like these that the real state of Circassian society and its mood become especially clear. The internal contradictions, the demands, and people's attitudes toward their own history. This year, we saw both attempts at open suppression and public reaction, as well as an information battle around the topic of memory, not only within the republics at home, but far beyond their borders as well. And here, it's probably best to start not with the events themselves, but with the atmosphere that began to form around May 21st, several days before the actual date. This year, it was noticeable that the authorities and related organizations approached the commemorative events much more cautiously than before. What's especially important here isn't even the fact that there was pressure. Most people have long been used to that, but rather the change in approach itself. For example, last year the situation unfolded more spontaneously. At first, people came out for memorial events, took part in marches, and only after that did the detentions and administrative arrests begin. In other words, the response was mostly reactive, happening after the fact. Additionally, it's impossible not to mention in this context last year's widespread campaign, where various activists and platforms called on people to join street protests. It was precisely this that later allowed law enforcement agencies to claim there was some kind of foreign extremist influence behind the public activity around May 21st, and the subsequent administrative arrests served as a kind of demonstration of the possible consequences for the most active participants. Here, of course, it's also important to mention the case of Ibrahim Nagoyev, who was sentenced to 11 years in a high-security prison, in part for administering the Circassian Republic Telegram channel. It was through this channel that calls to participate in street protests were published. After the verdict, the channel itself was deleted, and today the young man is serving a conspicuously harsh sentence. And unfortunately, this time, almost none of those who had actively called for such actions or supported these calls on other platforms publicly remembered his fate. Even though the question of people's responsibility, those who call for such actions while staying out of harm's way themselves, at the very least, deserve to be discussed. If before, one could still refer to not wanting to make things worse during the investigation, today that's no longer the case. Nagoyev is already in a high-security penal colony, and it would only make sense to see at least some formal attempts to draw attention to his fate. Talks, for example, about recognizing him as a political prisoner, or attempts to organize at least some kind of support for his family. The Nagoyev case became an important point where the system showed its utmost harshness, while the information space demonstrated a short memory. Given all these events, this year the background was different, and the system's preventative work started in advance. First and foremost, Kabardino-Balkaria stands out, as it is the most densely populated Circassian area on Earth. So back at the end of April, a report appeared about a meeting between the head of the region and the Anti-Terrorism Committee, where they decided to restrict mass events during the holidays, citing security concerns. And as May 21st approached, reports began to surface about mass attempts to issue warnings against participating in the traditional procession on the Day of Remembrance. After these reports started to become public, the Human Rights Center of Kabardino-Balkaria, led by Valery Katajukov, addressed an appeal to the head of the Republic. Representatives from the public, scientific, and cultural spheres of the Republic signed the appeal. A number of organizations in the diaspora also supported this initiative. Separate appeals were made, and on social media, a petition was launched in support of the state. And here, what's important is not even the number of signatures, but the very fact of a public response to attempts to restrict citizens' lawful right to self-expression. At the same time, messages began to appear in closed chats about warnings being sent through educational institutions, various administrations, and student groups. People were openly told that participating in street protests was forbidden, and the issue was under special scrutiny, and any attempts at self-organization will be met with extreme sensitivity. At the same time, as if in response to all the media buzz, just a couple of days before May 21st, the MCH Resources published a fairly extensive official schedule of events for several days ahead, and it is specifically emphasized that the march is not prohibited, even if there are certain restrictions regarding the sidewalks. It's clear that the topic of May 21st remains under heightened scrutiny by the authorities. But the real situation turns out to be more complicated than attempts to present it in strictly black and white terms. On one hand, there is an obvious desire to keep public activity around the commemorative date under maximum control. On the other hand, there's a reluctance to create the impression of a total ban on remembrance itself. In this situation, the behavior of so-called colleagues in the field, local public pages and bloggers who, in one way or another, work with national topics, deserve special attention. Usually, they actively comment on social processes, sometimes even claiming to offer their own analysis. However, when it comes to the topic of pressure and warnings, most of them chose to practically ignore it, clearly waiting to see how the situation would develop. But after the march itself, these same outlets are quite eager to publish beautiful materials from the event and share their own reflections. They discuss the politicization of these events by public activists and offer expert opinions on the proper forms of civic engagement. And this is a pretty telling story, because it turns out that almost everyone values the memory itself. But when it comes to talking about the uncomfortable side of what's happening, not everyone is willing to do so. The safe, officially sanctioned, and visually appealing part of the events is eagerly showcased, while topics like restrictions and social tension are left out of the picture. At the same time, those who talk about these issues are often labeled as outsiders. Everyone understands that for an objective analysis of what's happening, it's necessary to consider all sides of the issues. As early as May 20th, some media outlets reported that activists had no intention of giving up the traditional march, despite the pressure being put on them. And here, it's worth specifically mentioning the later attempts to manipulate the topic, whether or not permission was granted to march, because people are being convinced that the discussion was solely about banning the procession from moving along the roadway, while supposedly there were no restrictions on walking along the sidewalks. But that doesn't match what actually happened in the warnings, messages, and school group chats and other forms of pressure. The issue was specifically about the inadmissibility of participating in the march as such. That's why these kinds of attempts to substitute the actual subject of discussion might work under censorship and in a restricted public space, but they can't change the essence of what's happening. And the essence is that this year's march had great social and political significance. Right before everyone's asked, for those watching this situation around the world, Circassians once again took to the streets in a mass memorial march, and with that, society demonstrated much more than just a willingness to walk through the streets. It showed that the very historical memory within the people remains alive, despite years of attempts to reduce the topic of May 21st, either to a safe official ritual, or, on the contrary, to turn it solely into a tool of political confrontation. This means that the question of the very future of the people remains open. And here, it's important to talk not only about the fact that the march took place despite the bans. Something else is just as according. This year, the usual means of public mobilization that are common in the modern world were practically absent. There was no full-scale campaigning, no open calls, no normal dissemination of information, or even free discussion of the event as such. That's why it's almost impossible today to assess the real potential for public self-organization in the absence of such mechanisms. But even under these conditions, the column itself was extremely telling. And it's not just about the numbers. Despite the lack of full-fledged sociological research, even in the UK, it's visually clear that the topic of May 21st touches almost every layer of society. Children and elders, men and women, people in traditional national costumes and in modern stylized outfits, young women in hijabs and in European-style clothing. And this, perhaps, is one of the main observations today. The fate of the people and their attitude toward their own historical memory still unite people with different views. This means that society continues to live. The situation in Adagia is somewhat different, given the absolute minority of the indigenous population, as well as the noticeable weakening of the position of local elites in recent years. At the same time, it should be noted that the very history of confrontation around marches and threats of administrative consequences for participants is nothing new here either. Similar processes could be observed even in the pre-Olympic period. Back then, the leaders of local organizations also spoke about threats and risks. Here are two videos as examples. The first one is from 2012. A small group of young activists, despite the rainy weather, decides to hold a march. People are persistently trying to talk them out of him. The arguments are familiar. Moscow won't understand. There will be administrative consequences. They might even dissolve the Khans.
We're not in Russia. We're somewhere in Moscow. I explained it to him. This is our native land. They'll just have to put up with it, with this money. You have to take the internet into account. If you take this on yourself, then it's a big day. If they dissolve the Kaza, we'll handle it ourselves, the Adiga Yith. It's the Adiga youth that's on.
And as often happens, that kind of logic had the opposite effect. In the very next video, it's already 2013. There are way more people at the march now. And the leadership of the Kaza gives a pretty emotional speech in support of the event. Obviously, at some point, they decided that if you can't stop the process, it's better to lead it. In the following years, the march was already held under the auspices of the Kaza, whose leaders wore national dress. With the very same ribbons on their chest that were recently considered undesirable, they themselves led the column. And back then, the importance of preserving memory in public was never questioned. And
the organizers from ADGHS, the Circassian parliaments, and the participants in today's events all agree that such events are necessary.
We do this specifically so that our own people don't ever have to encounter such terrible tragedies on their life paths again, and so that all of our children will always remember exactly what happened here and just how incredibly precious a lasting peace truly is for everyone.
Why is this memory stop being so relevant today? That's a question I'd like to ask the participants in these processes. However, perhaps some answers can be found in recent interviews. Judging by the rhetoric, the problem now isn't that people are forgetting, but rather that, according to some, they've started to remember too actively.
A wide variety of different social media and digital platforms, especially the most popular ones today, are actively trying to exert a deeply negative and harmful influence on our youth. They are specifically using the diverse, multinational, and complex, multi-configurational nature of our large homeland, Russia, as a tool to set our younger generation against our own government by employing sophisticated Western technological tools in various foreign ideologies.
Nevertheless, in the regions of the Republic, the memory of those who fell for the freedom of Circassia was honored at monuments and memorials. And in the evening, a traditional candle lighting ceremony took place in Maykop. Of the Cherkessk Republic. In my opinion, the main event in terms of significance was held in the KAF-FED district, which included a procession through the streets. Formerly, this role was supposed to be played by Cherkessk. However, judging by the number of tricolors, it's only natural that some observers have questions about the symbolic meaning of what's happening. In the modern Russian state tradition, many figures associated with the conquest of the Caucasus are considered heroes and are part of the official historical pantheon. Against this backdrop, the attempt to simultaneously speak about the memory of Circassian resistance and organize events, in this kind of symbolism, it looks like an attempt to combine historically incompatible meanings. But apparently it's the year of unity in Russia. Events were held in the diaspora, and the twin city of Kayseri once again synchronized with Nalchik. The march turned out to be massive, and unlike in Nalchik itself, here the organizers didn't face any restrictions, even in such symbolic elements as the participation of horsemen. Memorial events were also held in other cities in Turkey, including, of course, Istanbul. The event was held in the format of a memorial evening. There was information that the march along one of the main streets to the Russian embassy, which had become a tradition in previous years, was once again not approved. So this time, participants limited themselves to speeches from the stage. It should be noted that there have been many critical reviews about the organization of events in the capital in recent years. It probably makes sense to have a separate conversation with representatives of the diaspora about the trends we're seeing. Or perhaps these issues will still be raised on new media platforms created by Circassians in Turkey. I would also like to highlight Syria separately, where, after many years of dictatorship, street memorial events have been held for the second year in a row. This time, the geography expanded. People took to the streets not only in central Damascus, but also in Aleppo. This example is especially telling, considering the long period when any possibility of such public activity was blocked. And I have to admit, it's nice to see that participants in these events in this country have no issues with Circassian flags. So much so that they could have shared them with those regions where, at this year's memorial events, the main symbol of resistance was clearly in short supply. To sum up, it can be said with confidence that today, among Circassians, there are practically no fundamental disagreements when it comes to assessing the past. That's exactly why many people's attention is gradually shifting toward discussing the future. And that in itself shows that people care about their own fate. However, it feels like in this flow of discussions, we spend too little time focusing on the present stage. And without an objective understanding of what's happening today, without open discussion and answers from current actors to important questions, it's hard to build realistic paths toward any goals. Let me give you an example. A few weeks ago, a debate broke out on social media over a comment made by the head of the Caucasus Federation of Turkey, the main partner of the ICA, regarding an event on the Circassian issue that took place in the Lithuanian parliament. We covered it in detail on our channel. He was asked a direct question, requested him to comment on the participation of representatives of the Circassian diaspora from Turkey in the event. Since he does not speak the native language, his comment was made in Turkish and then translated into Adig. In his comment in Turkish, he essentially says the following: KAF-FED as an organization did not participate in the event. Other organizations have the right to their own perspective, and he would prefer not to evaluate their activities. Let's listen to the original comment.
Well, of course, every institution has its own opinion, its own way of seeing things.
As for this issue, as the chairman of the Federation of Caucasian Peoples, I don't really want to comment. People are free. They make their own decisions and associate them with their organizations. There's really nothing much to say about this either.
However, the meaning in the Adagai translation is completely different. Essentially, the translator decided to supplement the Federation leader's position with his own interpretation. And this isn't just about an inaccurate translation. In the Adagi version, there's an evaluation of the event itself. It's called harmful. And along with that, there's also a judgment made about the Lithuanian people. There's a claim that Lithuanians supposedly haven't done anything useful for the Circassians and don't want to.
مخون فدسكبليه يشوا سبكم يشوا permission فدسكبليه
This situation sparked a very noticeable and widespread reaction across various social media platforms. Almost immediately, dozens of detailed posts and hundreds of individual comments began to appear everywhere, specifically addressing the Federation's top leadership and urgently asking them to clarify their official position on the matter. As far as I've been able to gather, there simply haven't been any formal public explanations or statements released about this yet, and the heated discussion itself now seems to be slowly fading away without any resolution. Here, in my opinion, a more important question arises. If the head of the KAF-FED doesn't want to comment on the event in Lithuania, that's his right. Although an open conversation on topics like this would definitely spark public interest and could be useful. But inevitably, another question comes up. Who exactly did the translation? And why were his personal opinions presented to the audience as the position of the leadership of the largest Circassian federation in Turkey? And what responsibility does the person who allowed this bear? The answer, apparently, is pretty predictable. No responsibility at all. In fact, in some circles, this kind of interpretation is even seen as a useful initiative. How this is perceived by tens of thousands of members is another question. As for KFE, unfortunately, that's also unknown. And at this point, it's not even about a dispute over a specific event or even about differences in political views. This is about something much more fundamental: responsibility for one's words and the accuracy of conveying positions, especially when they're voiced on behalf of major public institutions. I didn't plan to dwell on these kinds of issues in detail today, but maybe this example and these points will be useful for the emerging information space of Circassians in Turkey and, more broadly, for a culture of more open conversation. To sum up, let me say it once again. For most Circassians, memories of the past have long ceased to be a subject of dispute. More and more often, the discussions about the present and visions for the future. And that means, along with this, an inevitable need arises for a more mature conversation with open discussion, responsibility for one's words, and a willingness to answer tough questions. Because without an honest understanding of the present, it's hard to count on finding meaningful ways forward. New platforms are emerging, which I hope will be more sustainable than the previous ones. New voices and new topics for discussion. And most likely, the quality of this conversation will largely determine what the next stage of social development will look like. Well, as before, we will be watching these processes together with you. We don't intend to stay silent, and we'll speak the truth. Assalamu alaikum.
وتخزم يكبزر ويبسم تغش سعد الوجز وتكون يحب ترتاق وابن خججات